Welcome. Welcome once again, good people. I am Ian McKenzie, joined by
Zamir Danji.
We are the co-hosts, co-stewards of the Pandemic is a Prism series, which has been unfolding now, I suppose, the last 4 weeks or so.
Yeah, this is our fourth. Our fourth was with Pat McCabe yesterday.
Yeah. Beautiful conversation with Pat McCabe, who also has appeared prior, at least in my efforts around mythic masculine, as well as The Gathering of Stories, the first one. And so we were pretty excited to have Pat on the show this series to ask her about the pandemic. And she did not disappoint in bringing a lot of really beautiful offerings to this inquiry. For me, I think what stood out was, initially we opened with the words of the Hopi prophecy, or sort of attributed, which seemed to hit the mark and really showed up, as it seems to. Actually, the opening poems tend to show up throughout the interviews. But then that, I brought, I think, or you asked her to speak, or to offer her traditional greeting, or how she would greet, which was a beautiful way to hear her language. And then I believe I brought a question too of like, so what, what's going on? What's happening? How do we know? And she brought forth a sort of return to offering a prayer and a song to open the space, which again I thought was really beautiful, and definitely reoriented me to what this conversation might be, and how it might unfold.
Yeah, totally. I think that was something that was different about this conversation. Part of which I tuned into and was aware of, and in other ways was still kind of running on a parallel track of how we've normally been conducting these conversations. It seemed to me that it was more of a ceremonial invocation, as she said, to be vessels of certain inquiry and truth to be spoken through us, right? Mm-hmm. And that can mean letting go of whatever our agenda for me was. Okay, let's talk about this more in the context of the pandemic. And in this, it covered a whole, sort of circled around many different subjects, actually, that carry actually quite beautiful meaning and exploration, that I felt by the end of the conversation. There was a line that she said that tied back to me with this subject of this pandemic as a prism, which was that anything that is force must be undone. That line really stuck with me. I shared it in my class today, that it's almost like a law of nature. Because human beings have free will, and because we have free will, it means that it's a law that has to be respected, and we have to develop enough maturity to exercise that free will with power instead of force. And then it doesn't need to be undone, because you've done something that is rooted in integrity, and it's going to last. Otherwise, we have to keep learning our lessons again and again. In India, it's the law of karma that plays itself out again and again.
Yeah, thank you for that line. How it's turned to me, or I've turned it over since as well, is I believe it's this difference between force and contact, or force and relationship. And if we use the context of, as she did, she brought it to the indigenous colonial history right here on Turtle Island, North America, and how the way I heard it reverberate was the consequence of a colonial project of domination, of land theft, and resource extraction, and the residential schools, obviously, that came up quite powerfully. And what I heard in that was this sense that all of that was enacted through domination and violence by this colonial unfolding. And in some sense, so it's never been healed. It's never been really reconciled or accounted for, right, in the culture at large. And there's been sort of surface level platitudes, and in Canada they have the Truth and Reconciliation efforts, but really nothing significant has been done to fully account for what has been done. And that to me showed up in how that related to the pandemic as well, of like, what is the pandemic asking of us now, or what might it ask of us, and the willingness to actually to sit down to be in council? What does it mean to be truly in council? I mean, I think that was a beautiful question you brought as well, rather than a kind of charging ahead with the same story of progress and triumph that the dominant culture knows so well, and this deep desire to just get back to it, and yet the real consequence of getting back to it, but not changing the old story.
Well, the irony of that is that I was also bringing more of that let's get back to it energy, even though I'd like asked for counsel, right? There was this part of me that was pushing. Even she felt a bit badgered, and there was comments on the field that were like, yo, why are you interrupting or interjecting, and drop your ego thing. And there was that sort of like a pushing, saying like, but what is the act? What is our response though? Right? Kind of looking for an answer. And I'm aware that actually was uncomfortable for other people, and even for the speaker at times. And I'm in inquiry in myself of like, where is the place whereby we just allow, what I'm hearing the invitation is, be patient and allow the answer to come forth in its right time, right? Like you don't go straight for it, kind of walk around it, right? And sometimes walking around it can be a long walk around it, right? And in that long walk, you got to just pay attention to what the journey is, because there's little pieces along the way that are surreptitiously leading you in the direction of being able to receive the answer when it lands, right? Because otherwise, if you didn't do that walk around when it lands, you're like not able to see it because you didn't do the walk around properly, right? Or receive it. And so, and I became aware of that, me sort of wanting it to just be like, well, but how would you do it, right? And a part of that comes from this sense of recognizing that we're in a culture that lacks that patience of the walk around, right? And how are we able to do that kind of walk around, but also still speak meaningfully? I don't know if my computer seems to be frozen.
Oh, I can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, you can. Okay.
Yep.
It was frozen. So how do we do that walk around, but not in a way where people tune out because they're like, well, they're not actually really talking about the question. And if they're tuning out, when the answer lands, then they're not there to receive it either. And I see that happen a lot, right? I see that happen a lot. And part of my concern is, well, how do we do this dance where we walk around, but we still have to capture something in the center, then go and walk around again? I'm trying to learn that dance as well.
Yeah, this strikes me too as this this paradox, right? It's this: how do I get the goods? Let's say whatever that is. This is a question coming from like the dominant cultural mind. How do I get what I want, but not put all the effort that it takes to actually get what I want? Right. That sort of seems the crux of it. And maybe in that reverse, as us who are trying to be bridge builders into, what is going on and how do we offer something from this conversation series? This question comes up for us too, is, how do we be accessible to those that may not, be necessarily willing or interested to listen to this kind of thing. But in the very act of trying to make it more accessible, do we lose, the deep wisdom and the kind of effort required in order for it to be truly meaningful?
But this is the compromise. This is the compromise of living wisdom or mystical truth in the world on some level. We all come to count. I know what it's like to be in that situation very often as a yoga teacher, right? So many times I want to take people on understanding all this stuff of what yoga is about, but I realize that people come, I still have to take them through a movement practice of asana and breathing and what they know. And in the process, I'm taking and giving them and feeding the knowledge in, and then we pause, allow some of that, but then go back. So I find that dance is sort of, bridge builders have to do the dance. They have to do the dance.
Well, a couple other things that came up for me too. I had quite a few notes actually here, but one thing that came up for me was, she said, culture is not a human construct, right? Which I still am like, oof, that's a deep thread. Because again, yeah, I mean, because I'll draw a little bit on what I understand from my time with Stephen Jenkinson as well, who we interviewed last time. But he's spoken in this sense that culture, like true culture, is a real achievement. Right. And I think it's perhaps proper to recognize that the dominant culture, as we even use that term, right, the dominant culture, is more likely could be understood as not a culture at all, but an anti-culture, or you could say the absence of culture. If we understand culture to be something achieved rather than just something that, you know, sort of happens, or a certain type of, you know, North American cuisine, hot dogs and, you know, holidays, like, as in if it's something real that is cultivated, that is not inevitable, then where does it come from? Right. And this is what I think Pat was saying, that I would say it as it's informed by the land. It's informed by relationships to actual places. And in that sense, you know, modernity itself is characterized by it's now becoming more and more from nowhere, right? It's sort of this becoming this globalized, ubiquitous anti-culture, which at the same time feeds on real cultures, because there's actually nourishment there. And so again, it's this other question too with this pandemic is, you know, what happens in a time when this visitation arrives, in largely in a globalized kind of cultureless wasteland in some ways, and could the invitation be through voluntarily recognizing that the goddess of limit is among us, which is, you know, something that came up last time with Stephen, to voluntarily recognizing, oh wait, you know, whatever it was, whatever momentum I was on, whatever ideas I thought about what was meaningful and how to live, that those are up in question. They're to be questioned now, because like that prophecy said at the beginning, you know, to turn to more profound questions or more rooted questions, you know, where's your water? Like who's with you, you know, alongside in the stream, like really retracting the kind of busied mind from all the endeavors and all the doings that are really rooted in a kind of abstraction that is constantly drawing attention away from the things that really matter. I mean, that's how I experience so much of, you know, my day. Is like it takes real effort to stay focused on like, wait, what really matters? And in some ways, the pandemic has actually given the opportunity, right, to choose to halt or to deeply reflect upon a lot of what has just been habit or momentum. You know, so anyway, I'm curious what stirs for you.
I agree with you that it has done that, and that's why one of the reasons why it's very uncomfortable.
Mm.
Whenever we go against the grain of habit, it brings discomfort, right? And I think that, I mean, you said cultureless, but I feel it's the quality of the culture, right, that we decry when you say the absence of character within a culture, the absence of depth within a culture, which is you only get to see when you scratch it and you see if there's anything underneath, right? Mm. And the thing about crisis is what it does is it shakes up foundations. And if a culture is strong, then it responds to the crisis from a place of rootedness in a sense of character, value, meaning that is connected to the natural world, connected to their stories, right? Connected to their teachings. It's partially what I was trying to invoke from Pat in this conversation, kind of almost, as she said, forcefully. And if she's listening, I apologize if you felt that way. My intention was not to be disrespectful in any way, but it came from the shaking of saying, if you have an intact culture, show us how that intact culture would respond to this explicitly. Not. And I understand that part of the invitation was, well, walk around with me for a while and I'll kind of show you how we do it, right? It doesn't, we would do it in a different way. And the teaching was in how it was being done. And I appreciate that as well. But for those who need it spelled out a bit more, right? Which is hard, right? But that there are cultures that are more intact, and maybe one might say it's not a human construct in that apes have culture and birds have culture and all species have their own cultures, right? That arise organically from their interactions, which are not human constructs, right? But human beings build a culture in partnership of, ideally, with nature, and it's learning from nature and from the cosmos. If you're really disconnected from nature, you'll build a culture on top of it and to shut it out, or disconnected from what it's trying to teach you, and then you're really fucked, which is kind of a bit where we're at now, and that's the decrying of that loss. But human beings do have a role in the shaping of that culture, and we can look towards other cultures have done this partnership sustainably and wisely for guidance, saying, well, if you're saying we're lacking the culture of how to counsel or how to respond to these situations. So I brought up the children's fire. Show us an example. How would we do it? How have your people responded to this? And she did bring some amazing wisdom on, not just on this subject in particular, but it seemed many things that came through that touched people with what they needed to hear in the moment, which is, amazing.
Well, this goes back to that question again as well. Like, what can be transmitted that survives the transmission, right? If it again is made more accessible, or it's responding to a certain frame. If the question comes from a certain place, right? When you said, tell us what to do, it can have that energy of like, I want it now, right? But it's something that can't be granted now, or if it was granted with no effort, then it loses all potency. Right, in that sense, and so much of the culture at large is that, right? It's this idea, well, I want it now, instant gratification, and so to sit with, the discomfort, not until it becomes comfortable, because then it's no longer that valuable, but to stay uncomfortable, I think has a still a creative possibility. She used this phrase. I think that the grammar of the future is being developed now. Right, or at least we're longing or struggling to find the words, right, that can actually articulate the future, or the presence of the future amidst us. And again, I thought that was very powerful too, because in some ways it is about how language can grant the capacity to see or not, right? It can grant the world aliveness or not. We didn't touch on this too, but I know, for example, the English language itself with the verb to be, which doesn't exist in all languages. There's not an equivalent in all languages of this idea that you can draw through your language an atomized sense of oneself, devoid of any relational truth or reality, that other languages have. They turn them into verbs, right? Like all things are happening. They're a happening, and therefore are always relational. So again, it's like this sort of loneliness, which is becoming ever more acute. I mean, not just in modern culture, but also through the pandemic, is itself, this sort of, call it like the booby prize of the Anthropocene, right? When you're on top,
Booby prize, the Anthropocene.
That's pretty good. That could be a T-shirt. But when you're on top, if humans consider themselves on top, which of course is an utter fallacy, because we are the most dependent species out of all of them on every other species. But if we imagine ourselves to be on top, the lonelier we become, right? That seems to be built into the equation. And so, I mused, I think way back on the very first interview with Charles, this idea, or this relationship between immune and commune, right? That one seems to, build a barrier to the world. And in many ways it is through the vax, if that's the idea, I suppose, that it sort of keeps the world out. But then we have this other world, commune, right? Which is a way of participating in the world. And has an entirely other set of, relational understandings, wisdom, reciprocity, all the rest. It's bent from, or it's informed by relationship, as opposed to sort of spooked by it, you could say.
Yeah. Well, that I wanted to just carry that strand you said about, I think something you said reminded me of, a important part of, I think, Pat's conversation, which is around wealth inequality as being something that really came up, that she realized that, well, that's a thing for me, that's like something to get fiery about, because it's the same thing where, it's lonelier and lonelier as you get up at the top, right? Wealth, and there's this feeling of actually loneliness, and rather than allowing the world in, allowing people in. And you see that in more and more people, they accumulate wealth, or they get accustomed to certain ways of life as well, where I've seen that in my own family, actually. And I think that one of the challenges of COVID, or at least the way that we're being addressing with vaccine equity, the massive increase in wealth inequality that's happened as a result, with sort of this vacuuming effect of wealth being drawn out from the sort of more commoner spheres of life and entrepreneurship, and going into small and more concentrated hands, is we're seeing that it is highlighting how we have a system that favors inequality. Like it, if you are at the top, you're going to be able to drop more. And even this notion of um, of 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 vaccination, especially in many parts of the world where it's not yet accessible, right? It's a little bit more privileged. I know that there's a lot of efforts that are happening trying to spread this COVID vaccine to all parts of the world. I think it's a bit absurd to try to vaccinate 7 billion people. I just don't think that kind of mono solution is wise. And there's a lot of other arguments and evidences around potential dangers of doing that, just even in terms of mutations and variants of the virus, but also in sort of killing out treatment options, boosting natural health, that, we got to look at other options. But that kind of mentality and approach might also be a product of this kind of inequality, the system that we're in right now. I'm wondering if you're picking up what I'm putting down.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. I mean, this strikes me as well. I believe it was her that said, I know Elizabeth Sartoris also mentioned this, that a sort of monotheistic response to that. There's only one response, and it's to vaccinate. Yeah. Again, seems backed up by the science to say, well, yeah, because all these other ways are not effective, and so we have to do this. But again, it smuggles in a sort of, really a monotheistic deployment, again, of one way. Yeah. And so that itself is highly suspect. I mean, not the system doesn't think that's suspect. It just thinks it's doing everybody a favor, right? But
every system on top does.
Well, exactly. And so, yeah, that to bring forth this idea, look, many people have different ways to do things. Yeah. And this idea that this way, which is informed by a certain science, is the way, also doesn't take into account, I mean, like Elizabeth said as well, like that there's multiple kinds of sciences and multiple kinds of understandings. And even within, I was chatting with a friend too, who's quite versed in this stuff, just to say that even within the quote binary of like pro and anti-vax, there's a lot of nuance, right, between those. I mean, Pat even said in the interview, she said, well, I think she said either it's possible that it was, say, leaked or developed in a lab or something. Like she sort of admitted that she's like, well, that could be possible. But then even within that, was it intentional or not intentional? How they're responding, do vaxes generally work, or is it this specific one that is the one that is suspect because it's mRNA and blah, 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 right? Like there's a lot of diversity actually even within these quote binaries, which is also, I think, why sort of shaking free this idea that it can seem like that everyone on one side is all in agreement and then this is the way, isn't in fact true. That to be able to like get in there and to create space, to be able to like understand all the different nuances, I think is really vital. As just even a prayerful approach itself, as Pat demonstrated, right, was a completely other approach than we've even experienced here on the series so far.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the prayerful approach, it was interesting for me because I'm actually have a predilection for that approach, actually. Like there's a word that's lacking, but I'm sort of for that, right? And in this situation, it took me actually quite a while to catch on as to like, this was the invocation. And perhaps that is the challenge set before us. Will it ever happen in the mainstream? From the question that I brought forth to her, or maybe it was the way I think I recapped something where it was maybe this Hopi prophecy saying she called them lifeboats of resonance. She used
lifeboats of coherence.
Lifeboats of coherence, right? And I think that in those lifeboats of coherence, she's saying, let go of the shore, find that lifeboat of coherency and ride it, because it's unlikely that the dissonant system is going to find the requisite wisdom and prayerfulness to find that coherence. So you have to find it within places that you can and ride it. At least that's the sort of affirmation that I heard from her. I don't know if that's completely true. It may or may not be the case. I don't know. But
she could I add that too? Because she did tell that story, right, of the Polish farmers, I think she said, right? This idea that when there was a collapse in the culture, I can't remember when she was referring to, but there was this sense that the weight fell upon, or the attraction to coherence happened amongst the farmers who actually already had, relationships and systems of probably reciprocity and sharing. That's where people were drawn to, because that was a realm of coherence within the culture that had become incoherent. And so for me, that's also what I was taking from it. I was like, oh, interesting. So it's not so much abandon all those who, don't think the same or aren't willing to, but more like focus on where you can build coherent systems, within yourself and your probably closer relations. And in that sense, be at the ready, I suppose, for deeper disarray that, I would say no doubt is coming down the pipeline.
For sure.
And that in itself is a service, like, versus how do we go out and try to convince people to, wonder about these things? Because in that sense,
it's a lot more work. It is kind of like taking the boat upstream, right? I hear that, and that may just be the work that we have to do at this time, which is to find those lifeboats of coherence. But I do think that there's so many roles in this dance of life, this evolutionary dance, as Elizabeth Satura spoke. Everybody has a role. The virus has a role. The bacteria has a role. The plants and animals have a role. The predators. Everybody has a role in the thing. Right? And when you start to see that in the Vedic view or the Indian view, we see life as a leela or a play, and the world itself as a maya or an illusion. And everybody's taking a role within this play. And by doing so, you take it less personally, but you see the role for what it is, and you understand your role, and you play that role, right? And the willingness to play the roles as needed kind of frees you from this focus on, I am this personality, like this is what I have to be, right? And you can be the different roles required of you at this time, which might be necessary for some of us who may not have felt that, I'm not, that's not who I am, rather than, well, what role am I to play within this? And I do think we need roles that are bridging, roles that are finding those lifeboats, roles that are resisting. It's all necessary, right? It's all necessary.
Well, it just made me want to play the devil's advocate and say, so is Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos, are they playing their roles effectively? Because it seems like
absolutely. What's interesting is within the Indian mythology, you have two primary forces. Now we call it darkness and light. We use polarity, but they're called devas and asuras. Devas mean the beings of light, and asuras mean asurya, the beings against light. In the old stories, and the older you go back, the asuras are sometimes the devas. Sometimes they are actually, if you look today, for many people, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and all these people are actually the torch bearers for humanity and progress, depending on how you look at it. Other people look at them and they're like, these people are they're the representation of the darker impulse of where we're going, right? But do they have a role in the development of whatever this evolutionary trajectory is? Yes, clearly they do. They have an important role, right? And that's something we have to acknowledge and recognize. If we don't acknowledge it, it's at our peril, because they are an expression of life and reality right now. You can't not acknowledge reality. Reality is bigger than you.
Yeah, it's just, it's interesting because I do feel like I resonate with that. And then the other part of me too is like, so does that sort of it's all good then, man, like kind of seat, like, I'm not saying that that's where you're ending up, but I hear the echoes of somebody like, oh, okay, well, if we're all just playing our part, then all good. I could be a corporate raider capitalist, because I'm just playing my part. I could be Monsanto or Pfizer.
It's inauthentic. See, everybody's being what they are in a way that this is what they believe themselves to need to do. Well, if you really look at most people, they're just saying like, this is the right thing, or this is what I need to do, right? So as long as you're authentic, if you're saying like, well, I don't really feel I believe in this and I don't need to do it, but I'm just playing my role, right? Then that's inauthenticity, right? That's not life, right? But so we're not talking about that, but it's authenticity.
So if they hopefully, listen to this podcast and had an awakening, then they might authentically, change their position on the great unfolding dance. but it'd be from an authentic place. And maybe that's it too, that, I mean, and then I hear myself as well, like, well, do we have enough time to get everybody feeling authentic about their roles, right? As they're cutting down, old growth forests or fracking, that's the other question that hovers for me, right? The need to confront.
What it throws back upon ourselves is the beginning of our conversation, which was that, anything that's forced has to be redone. Right? That quality of, if you were to force those people to change, the same effect would be visited upon you, right? I mean, you're using force rather than power. Power comes through love, through knowledge, through authenticity, right? And through wisdom. And you have to trust in that power and keep radiating that power, keep embodying that power, because that's how then power rules the world. It doesn't have to be undone. If you use force, then you're going to have to go back and redo it again, because we're here to learn the lesson of power. We're here to wake up to our divinity. We're to wake up to our creatorship. In partnership with that, until we wake up to it, we're going to have to keep doing it again and again. At least that's the teachings from where I come from.
Well, let's leave it there then. We're over time on our 30-minute recap with Pat. Appreciating the time again, Zamir. Love getting into it with you.
Thank you.
And thanks for listening. For those who are tuning in, the whole series is available at gatheringofstories.com/pandemic. And you can check out the previous interviews that we've done, replays, as well as we're about to launch into the next 4 interview series on this conversation. The pandemic
next, right?
No, Bio Komalafe.
Komalafe.
Yeah, okay. Which will be a real trip. He wrote an essay early days about the coronavirus as this psychedelic deity. So in some ways, it was one of the initial inspirations actually for this whole thing. So I'm really glad we have him, and stay tuned.
Okay.